this is the Provoked Prawn, and this is the Deepcool LT720. This is a 360mm all-in-one cooler, and in this video I'm going to be unboxing and setting this up and then installing some Lian Li fans on it, because I'm a madman and I wanted to show what the process is for the standard installation, as well as the setup with some different fans for RGB lighting. Now, this is a 360mm cooler which has an infinity mirror on the pump head, as you can see, but there's more to it than that, because this is an interesting design that includes Deepcool's 4th generation pump. It also has an anti-leak technology built into it that you can see mentioned on the back of the box here. And it uses Deepcool's own pump system, high-performance water cooling pump, rather than ASUS pump system that most all-in-one coolers use. It also has these FK120 fans included, which are designed to give you a good range of cooling performance, with PWM controllable dynamic fluid bearing fans that spin from 500 to 2250 RPM and give 85.85 CFM airflow and a number of other highlights to them. They aren't RGB though, hence one of the reasons why I wanted to change out the fans included as standard for a more interesting look. However, in performance terms, they should be nice and efficient and also quiet. Now, in this build, I'm going to be doing an Intel setup with an LGA 1700 socket, but it will work with a number of other sockets. So it's compatible with both AMD and Intel, and the instructions in the box will talk about the various different setup processes for LGA 2066, 2011, 1700, 1200, 1150, and more. There are some other interesting highlights to it. You'll see that it has pre-applied thermal paste, and obviously it's all-in-one liquid cooler, so the coolant is already inside. That infinity mirror cap that you've seen is removable, and it's worth noting there's some plastic peel on it that I'd recommend taking off before you install it, and it's held in place with magnets onto the pump head as well. You'll also notice there's a little cover on the pump to protect the thermal paste, and I actually will talk a bit later on about how I adjusted that, because there's one small downside to this build process which is worth bearing in mind. Off that comes one single cable that connects to the all-in-one pump header on your motherboard, and I'll show you the setup process for that. I'm going to go into all the fine details of where to plug cables in and how you set things up in this guide, so hopefully it'll be really useful to you. But there are some things of interest. For example, you've got the Deepcool logo on one side, and then that little tool on the right hand side which I showed you, which is all about that anti-leak technology to stop it leaking. So this should provide years of good cooling performance, and it's warranted up to 5 years as well. Now, as standard, once you've got that cap off, it looks pretty boring in terms of the design of the pump, but what I'm happy to report is it actually runs quite quiet. It's a low decibel, 19 decibel maximum pump noise getting out of it as well. I've done some benchmark testing with it, and I found it ran really quiet, even with the Lian Li fans on it as well, which is really nice. You've only got RGB lighting on this pump head through the infinity mirror setup, and obviously that connects up to your motherboard. You'll notice there's a daisy chain cable set up on here though, so if you do have some connections for other RGB things from Deepcool, you can connect them up via this system, and theoretically daisy chain things up really nicely that way. So there's plenty of connectivity options and a relatively easy setup. Now, I'm using an NZXT H7 Flow case that you saw earlier on. I'm going to be setting this 360mm rad up on the top of the case with exhausting out the top. So if you want to do that, you set up the fans in a position where the label faces towards the direction you want to pull air from. So in this case, facing them down towards the bottom of the case to pull air through the radiator and exhaust out the top. While doing this, it's worth thinking about the logic of how you're going to install the radiator, where it's going to be positioned, and then you can work out which direction the cable is going to go. So you'll see, for example, I've turned the fans round just then because I realised I want to make sure the cables are facing towards the rear of the case so I can keep things nice and neat. So there's something to bear in mind. You don't want to end up installing the radiator and then finding the cables are all in the way. Now, there are some really nice highlights to this all-in-one cooler that include simple things like this splitter cable, which is essentially a way to connect all 3 fans to a single fan connection. I'll show you that in a second for the process for that. It also has all the long screws that you'd need for mounting the fans to the radiator, and then the small screws that you'd need for mounting the radiator to the case. The other bag includes the screws necessary for mounting the pump head to the standoffs, and also you have AMD and Intel brackets in there as well. So I'm going to talk you through the process for the Intel LGA 1700. I'll show you the basic installation first. So as standard, you want to mount these radiator fans, as I said, like this. Now you do have a couple of options, and I've been asked recently about different ways to do it, because sometimes I install fans the other way to pull cold air into the case, depending on where I've mounted it. So if you're front mounting a radiator, I'd actually consider doing it that way. So instead of exhausting through it, pull cold air in. My experience actually is it doesn't really matter which way around you do it, as long as there's a good logic and a good intake into the case and then a good exhaust, it should run cool. And my experience with this is then this setup with an exhaust, it works perfectly fine and gives you good experience as well. So this daisy chain cable allows you to connect up all three of those cables to one single connection. So it's really straightforward. You basically plug in each of these cables into that, and then you just connect that up to your motherboard. What this does is it gives you motherboard control over the fan speed, and then you're separately connecting up the pump head to the all-in-one connection, so that AIO pump usually, or water cooler pump connection on your motherboard, so that both things are controlled by the motherboard and by the BIOS, and you can set those up. Now these are PWM fans as well, so you do have control over them. If you have some motherboard software that PWM control, so you can set a fan curve on it, for example. But you'll notice on this motherboard, both the CPU fan and all-in-one pump head are at the top right of the motherboard. So you're just plugging in the CPU fans to the left side, and then once we get to the pump head in a second, it plugs in next to it. So you're connecting up both those things. And this just has a single cable coming out of it. But then once you put the infinity mirror on top, you've got the extra cables for the RGB. So this is actually a really simple installation and one of the easiest all-in-one coolers that I've actually had the pleasure of installing for this reason and for the others, in terms of the setup of how it works and just sort of the mounting process. I'm going to show you each of the steps for this as well. But before I get to that, I want to talk about the logic of removing and installing the AL120 fans. Obviously, I want to keep some of the RGB lighting uniform throughout the case. Now, you could argue that perhaps I'm taking away from the cooling performance. Obviously, these fans that come with a cooler are designed specifically for it to deliver the best possible cooling experience. However, they don't look as nice, and it would look weird to have black fans when I've got these white fans throughout the rest of the case. And it is perfectly acceptable to do this. I've done it on a lot of different builds and found that the cooling is still pretty good and not problematic either. And because of the logic of this, as I'll show you in a second, it's really easy to still sort out the same logic. So once again, what I'm doing here is the same process. Essentially, I'm mounting these fans so they'll be pulling air out of the case, through the radiator and out the top. So mounting them again in that position. But there's ever so slightly different logic in how you connect things up, because this obviously has RGB lighting now. So there's a Lian Li AL120 controller, which you can see me using here. Two cables come out of that fan because the daisy chain fans that just click together, and then you have two cables instead of three. But one is for RGB lighting, it plugs into the cable box here, and then the other one is for fan power. Now, normally you'd plug that in there as well, so you'd have both cables connected up to this controller. But because these are mounted on a radiator, I'd actually recommend taking the power cable connection and using the same logic that I did with DeepCool fans, so simply plugging it into the CPU fan header on your motherboard. Now, I'm showing you this all outside the case, so it's really easy to see. And I recommend not plugging that cable in just yet, but I just wanted to demonstrate where it connects up so it's really visible and really obvious for you, make life a little bit easier. So the next stage is now preparing the cooler, the pump head, the mounting brackets and other things. As I said already, this has AMD brackets and Intel. They're separated out into two different bags, and it's pretty easy to see the difference between them thanks to the labeling in the manual. You'll also notice that you get 4 lots of standoffs, so you can see the difference here between them. You have circular ones, and then you've got these ones with the notches on for the LGA 1700. So the ones with the circles on are for 1151, 1155, etc. And so I'm separated, got rid of those ones because I'm using the LGA 1700 socket here, and then I'll just get everything that I need for this. So what we've got to do is we've got to mount those brackets onto the pump head. And one of the things of note here I mentioned earlier on is there's a plastic cover over the top of the pump head, which is there to protect the thermal paste that's already pre-applied. If you go to install this bracket, you have to remove that cover, and then you can't put it back on. So what I actually did just to protect it temporarily. I just took the cover off, cut round it so I could access all the screw holes. So I basically made it smaller so that I can then put these brackets on, but then also still go about the rest of the build process without worrying about whether I was actually going to knock the pump head and remove some of that thermal paste. Obviously, you don't want to damage the thermal paste or lose any of it in the build process, but I also wanted to get this set up so it was ready to get into the case once I finished building the rest of it, and that'll make things a little bit easier. So just bear that in mind. This might be the same sort of logical process to follow that I've just done. Hopefully that'll be helpful. You can just trim that plastic down with a pair of scissors, which is what I did, and then you can put the brackets in place. So you can see these brackets mount with the tiny little screws that were included in that first packet I showed you earlier on, where you had the standoff screws and the tiny screws. Those small screws are used here to install this bracket. And then this bracket mounts over the top of the back plate, which I'll show you where to put that in a second. And then you just use standoffs and the thumb screws to mount it all down. The idea here is you making sure that there's a good solid connection between this copper plate with the thermal paste and your CPU, so it's all mounted properly. Things to bear in mind is making sure that it is mounted well and that you don't damage that thermal paste, because otherwise your performance may suffer. Now this is the Intel backplate. This actually works with various different Intel sockets. You can see it's clearly labeled Intel on there. And for the LGA 1700, you need to make sure that the pins on it are pushed out as far as possible, so it's extendable, as you can see here, and they just clip out into the corners. Once you've done that, you then just put it through the back of the motherboard. Again, I'm demonstrating this outside the case, and I think it's actually easier to do this part outside the build before you've finished it, but if you can access the rear of the case, you can do this when your motherboard's mounted if you prefer. Then we obviously are using those 4 standoffs that I showed you earlier on with a 1700 written on them that are notched, and when you put them over the top of the standoffs, this basically allows the cooler to mount properly in the right position so that it will sit nicely on top of the CPU. You can see you've got the CPU already pre-installed here as well, so basically everything's ready to go now. I've skipped a couple of stages, but if you do want to see the full build process for this, I'll leave a link to it in the description so you can see how I built the case and the rest of the things to keep in mind. And then I'm mounting the radiator. Now you did have options for front mounting the rad, but I'm going for the top mounting, and you can see you could also potentially mount the pipes at the back, so you could do tubes to the rear instead if you weren't using a rear exhaust fan. But we need to make sure we're mounting this down in the proper way. Now, obviously, you've got to make sure you remove that plastic cap so that you have a good connection between the cooler and the CPU, nothing in the way, and then seat it down. Now, note that the tubes are coming out the bottom of the pump, and that's because with this cooler, that device that sits over the top, so the infinity mirror cover, has notches cut out the bottom of it where the tubes will come out of, so this is the correct position for it. Once that's seated down, then use the thumb screws in each of the 4 corners to tighten it up. Make sure it's nice and tight, but be careful not to over tighten it and don't be too aggressive because you don't want to damage the motherboard. But you also do need to make sure it's seated down well. And I'd recommend running benchmarks that you'll see me doing later on to make sure the temps are good, because if you haven't seated it down properly, you may find the CPU gets too hot. A reminder now to plug in the AIO pump power connection from the pump head. So that single cable that comes out of the pump, connect that up to the top of the motherboard. You can see it's a bit more fiddly now. It's in the case, and it's also more difficult for you to see, which is the reason why I showed you earlier on where it was. And then just tuck that cable away. Now this has a number of clips on the tube, so you can neaten things up and make it look nice and tidy, which is definitely a bonus. And there's a nice little bit of thought here from Deepcool and various different things, obviously with the design of the pump, the anti-leak system, this mirror system here as well. Now, quick note, there is some plastic cover peel on the mirror to protect it. Peel that off now before you go about the installation of the rest of it, because it does become quite fiddly otherwise. I didn't do it, and that was my mistake. You can see then it then just clips into place with magnets, and that's really easy to do. Then there's an RGB cable that comes out of that. It's necessary to connect that up so that you get that nice RGB effect that you saw at the beginning, and you'll see again in a second. And then you need to run that cable through to the nearest 5-volt RGB header on your motherboard. Unfortunately, this motherboard's quite limited, so there's only one connection on the bottom left, and this is where I came across a problem because the cable is not long enough. But you can see the grey connection here, 5-volt ARGB1 marked in the bottom. So we just need to run the cable down to there and plug it in. Obviously, this is outside the motherboard, just to give you a quick and easy view of that, but we need to work out a way to be able to run that down there. And what I found, unfortunately, is that I couldn't run it to the top or the side to be able to get it down to the bottom. But that's a small point. You might not have this problem. You might have multiple ARGB headers on your motherboard, hopefully. Then you use the tiny little screws that are included in there to mount the radiator to the top of the case, obviously ensuring to use all of them. I'm skipping some of the steps here because you don't want to watch me screwing in tiny screws into a radiator for the next few minutes, but do this while it's laying down so that it obviously doesn't fall out and we can secure it nicely. And then you've basically got the entire thing set up and ready to go, and we can just go about the connections for the fans. Now, I obviously made things a bit more complicated with the RGB fans because as standard, you just connect up the normal fans, plug them in with the 3 cable daisy chain effect into the CPU cooler, and then you're done. You only need the RGB connection for the pump head. Everything's already controlled really easily, so adding some RGB fans to it does complicate things a little bit, but the process here is still pretty straightforward because I'm also using RGB fans throughout the entire case. Now, I've done a video separately on how to set up Lian Li's fans, whether using the AL120s or the more recent SL120 Infinity fans or the SL120 V2s. I'll link to those videos in the description. Basically, this controller controls the RGB lighting and the power, and it just needs SATA power connection and a USB connection on the motherboard, and that allows you to then control the RGB lighting and the fan speed from Lian Li's L-Connect software. Once that's all done, just turning it on and making sure everything runs. Once again, as I said, if you want to control the fans, you can plug those directly into the CPU header with the power cable, so that will make sure that they get good cooling there. So then we have the finished product. Now, I'll show you in a second the benchmarks I did on this, but my experience and just the day-to-day running of it and tests that I was doing in various different ways is that it runs really quietly in this case. Now, obviously, it's going to vary from machine to machine, and perhaps the benchmarks aren't fair because it's not the standard fans. I think if you use the standard fans, you'll probably get actually better performance, and it's obviously going to vary depending on the setup of your case and the parts you're using. I'll leave all the specs for this build in the description so you can find out more about what I've used in terms of the CPU and other things, and also a link to the full build guide on this if you want to check it out. But my experience was quiet and nice looking. I think the RGB works really well. That infinity mirror looks really neat as well, and simplistic because there's no USB connection on it, so you haven't got excessive software. You don't need to download Deepcool software, for example, to control the RGB lighting on it. So it's simplistic and it's going to not add any extra bloatware to your PC. So all told, a really good setup. Once it was all installed and running nicely on Windows setup, I wanted to run some benchmarks, and I highly recommend doing the same if you've got a fresh installation, just to make sure everything's running as it should be. Now, this is Cinebench R23, which is a tool that you can download and use for free, and I'll leave a link to it in the description. And you can run multi-threaded tests on this, which puts the CPU under some pretty heavy load, much more than you normally get for gaming purposes. I'm using hardware info as well to monitor the performance during the testing. It gives you an idea of the minimum maximum temperatures and other things, and I'll leave a link to that in the description because it's another tool that you can use. And here you can see the 12th generation Core i7-12700K and the temps that it got during the process. You can see we topped out at 82 degrees on here, and that is actually not too bad for this CPU. If you found that you're in the 90s and the high 90s, that could potentially be an issue, but to be honest, under this sort of level of testing, quite aggressive benchmarking, this isn't terrible. You'll find that it runs a lot cooler than this. Reasons I do this is if it runs a lot hotter, there may be reasons to look at it, to test, and make sure that the pump is seated down correctly, that it's tightened up nicely. Maybe apply some more thermal paste if there's been an issue with the thermal paste, and check things like that. But this is pretty good performance, and it ran really quietly during this as well, so the fans weren't like ramping up super fast. They weren't on maximum speed all the time, so overall a great experience. Hopefully you found this video useful. Let me know in the comments if you've got any questions.
You've made it right to the end of the video, you brilliant legend you. If you've enjoyed it, click that subscribe button, give me a thumbs up, and drop me a comment down below if you've got any questions. If you really enjoyed it, consider joining the channel and see the benefits of doing so. Check out these other videos. You might well find them interesting or useful, and most importantly, have a great life.